The Canadian economy is driven by trade and is one of a small number of countries who can boast they export more energy than they import. As such, they are heavily reliant on the global economy and in particular the United States. But with current problems, the economy has held up relatively well, with GDP growth over 2% since early 2010. Joining me to discuss the situation in Canada and the Canadian dollar is John Hancock of the World Trade Organization here in Geneva and former senior advisor to the Canada Trade Minister. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Hancock. Welcome to Dukascopy TV. Let's start by talking about some consumer spending figures. For September, up 1%, biggest gain in nearly a year. We hear when we talk about the US economy, consumer spending very important. Is it as important for the Canadian economy? Is this good news?
Yeah, it's good news and it's important. It's not as important as the US figures, probably for the simple reason that Canada's a smaller economy. We're much more externally dependent. Trade is something like 30% of our GDP. So consumer spending is good news and you want to see figures like that, but it's not the whole story in Canada's case.
Okay, you mentioned in your first answer about the fact that Canada is very reliant on what happens elsewhere. We saw Prime Minister Stephen Harper said this month at the APEC conference, the Asia Pacific Summit, that Canada will be looking more and more to Asia in the future. Let's have a little listen to what he had to say.
Canada had FTAs with free trade agreements with only 5 countries when we came to office in 2006. We now have agreements with 14 countries and active negotiations with over 50 others.
So Prime Minister Harper there talking about free trade agreements with Asia Pacific countries. They're developing. The USA and Europe are also looking to develop ties in Asia. It seems everyone is really. China are struggling as well. How reliant can Canada be on Asia Pacific? Have they got an advantage over the USA or Europe in that area?
That's a very good question. I think what Prime Minister Harper is saying is not wrong. I mean, if you were looking at Canada's trade patterns, the dominant relationship is the United States by far. I mean, something like between 80 and 84% of our exports go to the United States. So we're highly dependent on the US. But it's a mature market. Europe's a mature market. And you look at the growth figures of China and India or Brazil, quite clearly any country in Canada's position would want to deepen and intensify its links with those countries. And Canada's in a fairly fortunate position from a negotiating point of view. Maybe we're slightly late to the table in terms of negotiating bilateral deals, but we're a major commodity exporter. For countries like China, India, these are important exports, and it gives us a certain edge in opening these doors.
Okay, let's move on to talk about the Canadian dollar now. It was in the news because I believe you've got this new polymer $100 banknote, sort of a plastic banknote, and I think by 2013 all the Canadian dollars are going to be this plastic polymer. On a more serious note, looking at the Canadian dollar against the US dollar, I think we can see a chart of the most recent performance here. So in the last couple of months, pretty volatile. What's driving the Canadian dollar? Is it commodities? Is it oil? Is it global problems?
It's interesting you say that. First of all, because of the trade relationship with the United States, the Canadian dollar globally tracks the US dollar largely, and I think your chart more or less shows this. But underneath that basic relationship is commodities, and particularly oil. The Canadian dollar is effectively a petrodollar. And as Canadian exports to the US market go up, the Canadian dollar goes up in locksteps. When exports to the US of oil and energy decline, the Canadian dollar goes down. In fact, it's almost a formula. A $1 increase in the barrel of oil translates roughly into a 0.5 cent increase in the Canadian dollar.
Really? So that direct correlation?
Direct. You can actually watch it, yeah. You can chart the Canadian dollar by the price of oil.
That's absolutely fascinating. Where do you see the Canadian dollar heading then? With oil prices at the moment, problems in the Middle East, is that going to affect the Canadian dollar?
I think you'd have to be very bullish about Canada. With the rise of China, the rise of India. I read a statistic the other day that China and India together are putting 100,000 new cars on the road every day. And those cars have to be filled up with
oil,
petrol.
with petrol.
So I think most observers of the Canadian scene would say for all the other problems on the immediate horizon, long-term commodities look very good. So I'd be fairly bullish on Canada and on the dollar.